military uniform. There were Boy Scout troops all saluting. I remember again passing a little league field where all the players, all the coaches, all the umpires, all the audience and the bleachers were standing. The kids with their gloves at their chest, and and then we got to Washington D.C. and President Johnson met us at the airport with a convoy, and we drove up past the mall, and on the mall there were about 10,000 poor people. My father and Martin Luther King. Martin Luther King had died 2 months before. But the last thing they did together was to organize a march of poor people in Washington. They saw the Vietnam War was destroying the poverty programs in this country, and they both agreed the only way to get government to turn to the ideas of poverty, to the issues of poverty, was to bring thousands of poor people and camp them on the mall and keep them there while Congress did something. It was the last thing that they did together, and those anyway, I think I'll stop using that. But they were camped on the mall in shanties and plastic shacks and tents. They all came to the sidewalk and they stood with their hats at their chests, with their heads bowed 8 deep. And we drove my father up to Arlington, up the hill, to bury him next to his brother under a small stone. And I remember 4 years later reading, I was at college in Boston then, and I was reading demographic data that showed that a great majority of those white men who had stood along the track, who had strongly supported my father in 1968, 4 years later, did not vote for George McGovern in '72 presidential campaign, who was perfectly aligned with my father on all the issues, had been a friend of my dad's. And instead they voted for George Wallace, who was diametrically opposed to everything my father believed, and he'd been a nemesis, an opponent, an adversary of my father. He was the biggest advocate then for racial segregation in the country. Famously said, racial segregation today, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever. That was in his campaign announcement. He stood in the schoolhouse door and blocked my father from bringing 6 black students into the University of Alabama. So he was a genuine, full-born racist. I knew him quite well later on in his life. But it struck me then, when I saw all those people who supported my father were now supporting somebody completely the opposite. And it's occurred to me many times since that every nation, like every individual, has a darker side and a lighter side. And the easiest thing for a political leader to do is to appeal to our darker angels, our greed, our anger, our racism, our bigotry, our xenophobia, and just self-interest, and the much more, and fear, and we all have seen that. And the much harder thing to do was the thing my father was trying to do, which was to get each of us to find a hero inside of ourselves and to transcend these issues of self-interest and see themselves as part of a community, part of a noble endeavor, part of a great adventure to make this country an exemplary nation. And he succeeded in doing that. He was able to bring people together and unify them. And that part of American history was easily as divided as it is today. We had 127 cities burned. That's after Martin Luther King died. In the summer before, the same thing. We had the military shooting students to death on college campuses, and we had radical groups like the Weathermen blowing up buildings on college campuses in New York City and elsewhere. So it was really, people don't remember how divisive it was. It was extremely divisive, but my father was able to heal that. And that's what he set out to do. On the last day of his life, he won the most urban state in our country, California, and he won the most rural state, South Dakota. And he succeeded in bringing all these people together. And at the beginning of my campaign, I promised that I was not going to feed the rancor and the vitriol, this polarization that is now as divisive as, as at any time since the American Civil War. And that is really threatening to tear our country to pieces. And that I was going to focus on finding the values that we share in common, other than focusing on these little culture war issues that BlackRock, State Street, Vanguard, the pharmaceutical companies, the military-industrial complex use to keep us at each other's throats so that we don't see what they're doing. It's like they're jangling the keys. They're jangling the keys over here and saying, look at this. Well, they robbed the bank over here.
Mm-hmm.
And we all fall for it. We're all hating on each other, and we don't do anything about it. And when the king and queen look out over the balustrades of their castles and they see all their subjects fighting each other, they go back to the banquet hall and they pop champagne corks because they know nobody's coming over the wall for them. And what I said at that time is that I'm going to bring people together and stop the vitriol and the hatred and unify Americans and bring them over the wall and take our country back.
Yay!
Yay!
I found all of these issues that we all agree on. I stay away from the divisive issues. Everybody thinks that kids your age should be able to get mortgages and own homes. Everybody agrees on that. Nobody thinks it's a good idea that we have a $34 trillion debt that you guys are going to pay. And in the last 100 days, we've added $1 trillion to that. We're already paying to service our debt. We pay more than the military budget. If interest rates go up, that goes. Every time interest rate doubles, that doubles. And every time that we're adding more within a decade. Every dollar that we collect in taxes is going to go to the service of debt. Who believes that's sustainable? And yet, why isn't anybody talking about it?
Mm-hmm.
Nobody's talking about the chronic disease epidemic that's debilitated this, your generation particularly. The issues like the border, nobody thinks it's a good idea that Mexican drug cartels are running our border policy.
Mm-hmm.
Yay.
Everybody thinks that we should protect the environment. If you talk about climate change, you're going to get a fist fight. If you talk about clean air, clean water, restoring our soils, regenerative agriculture, good food, protecting our Purple Mountains majesty, our sacred places, everybody gets together. When I was fighting the Flint water crisis, we had, with the lead in the water in Flint, we had Hell's Angels standing shoulder to shoulder with urban blacks because everybody wants clean water. Nobody thinks it's a good idea. That, our most of the water supply in this country is contaminated now with pesticides and metals and atrazine and neonicotinoid and glyphosate and all these other poisons. Everybody thinks we should have the best educated children in the world, which we did when I was a kid. We have the best education system on earth. We can have that again, but we need to do charter schools. We need to do school choice. And everybody thinks, theoretically at least, that we ought to have free speech. And so I've been focusing on those things and many, many others, and I found this huge area of agreement. And I'm confident that we're uniting, like Tony said. 70% of Americans don't believe that don't want a choice of the two guys who are running.
Yep.
Yeah.
They don't want to vote against somebody. They don't want to pick the lesser of two evils. They want to pick somebody they believe in and somebody they like. And by the way, my favorability ratings are 20 points ahead of anybody else that they tested.
Woo!
Woo!
Yay!
When I get there, I can fix our government. I've spent 40 years suing these agencies. I know how to unravel agency capture. But I can't do it alone. I need an army. I need all of you, and I'm really grateful for you coming out and signing a check and, you know, coming here on a Saturday night for a political gathering. I'm sure a lot of you have better things to do, so I'm very, very grateful.
Kidding.